that it's difficult to do justice in introducing her in brief. I can only say that she has published more than 15 books, including Women in Between, The Gender of Gift, After Nature, English Kinship in the late 20th century, and also I'd like to mention edited book, Audit Cultures, Anthropological Studies in Accountability, Ethics, and the Academy. She was also elected mistress of her Cambridge alma mater, Girton College, in 1998. She's a fellow of the British Academy, foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the recipient of the American Viking Fundamental, holder of the Huxley Memorial Medal, honorary life president of the Association of Social Anthropologists, and in 2001, Professor Strathern was made commander of the British Empire of Services to Social Anthropology. She has been described as contemporary anthropology's sharpest and most original mind. She has been working among the natives of Papua New Guinea and dealt with contemporary issues in the UK. In the Papua New Guinea, she mainly studied gender and kinship, and in the UK, she has focused on kinship, reproductive technologies, biomedical ethics, audit culture, and the concepts of intellectual property. In these studies, she has challenged a number of the most fundamental concepts in analytical discourse. The concepts of individual and society, of the person, of social relations, the comparative method, the notion of nature and the culture, and the notion of male and female, and so on. Today, she's going to talk about relations, being one, being multiple. A future for anthropological relations is the title of the talk. After her lecture, about 1 hour, we will have comments from the discussants, Atsuro Morita of Osaka University and Hugh Raffles of the New School. All right, please.
And thank you so much for your kind words. Secretary General and President, Professor Koizumi, it's a great honour to be here under the auspices of the IUAES and of course YASCA, and if truth be told, a little humbling to be in this company. In thanking our hosts for the occasion and for the inspiration, I have to say how much I appreciate the manner in which the conveners have set out their invitation to think about the future. At the same time, I am all too aware that I am unlikely to say anything about the future that this distinguished audience does not already know about the present. In this anniversary year of the Japanese Society of Social and Cultural Anthropology, I cast back to the founding of the British version, the Association of Social Anthropologists, the ASA, in 1946, when a sense of a new school of social anthropology was in the air. It's been said that the closeness of the fraternity was one way in which the highly amorphous, the vague, the formless subject of anthropology was given some manageable bounds. It was not the paradigms or the models alone that made the subject, but the interchanges and what we would today call the networks between practitioners. Nothing unusual, for this is a combination that people already in communication take for granted. But I see it as an aspiration of this meeting in Tokyo, at least where we have not, until now, been able to make assumptions about communication. As to the future, I suspect that academics divide into those who imagine the future as a road ahead of them, stretching into the distance, and those for whom the future already hides in their surroundings, jumping out to everyone's surprise. You never know what's going to appear, or who is going to walk through the door, or for that matter, when you open the door or slide a partition, what you're going to see outside. The former vision, the road ahead, is more conducive to a narrative, but I've only ever been able to imagine the second kind. This address hopes to open one or two doors. We've been asked to think about the future with anthropology in it, and a question follows. What might we value about anthropology that the future is unimaginable without it? A beginning of an answer lies in our conference theme, the discipline's multiplicity. In English, multiplication covers both reproduction, as in speaking of a discipline reproducing itself, and diversification, as in thinking of the diverse anthropologies that will proliferate through different interests. To have a future, anthropology must at once be recognizable as itself, as an entity, and be able to flourish in numerous and unforeseen circumstances as multiple entities. This is, after all, a matter of life. Life is always at some stage or moment of being. That's obvious. Less obvious is that what we perceive as one or multiple will depend, among other things, on the relations that we draw between such moments. Depictions of two life processes make the point. Think on the one hand of beings propagated through transplantation, and on the other of their being transformed through metamorphosis. To mention transplanting brings familiar images to mind. Transplanting literally involves removing a plant from one location to another, so a plant may have dual locations, indeed requires both to flourish properly. The term transplant also has a long history with reference to removing people from one place to another. A specific connotation was given to it by John Muke, a scholar from the Papua New Guinea highlands, when addressing an anthropological audience. He used it, transplantation, to translate a concept crucial to the kinship thinking of the people from whom he came. Clan membership is through the father, but one's mother's kin are one's base or root. From a clan perspective, a sister's child growing up in another clan is, he said, a transplant of material from one's own. Distinct origins are conserved. The maternal clan is a stock, if you like, with cuttings taken from it that are planted in other soil. My illustration is not in fact from the area of which he was speaking, but from a neighbouring one with which I'm familiar. The point is that the relationship endures over the generations. Here you see mourners of a clansman's death, and these mourners are seeing him from the perspective of his maternal clan, whose transplant he is. So they're readying themselves to greet the deceased's root people, not yet in sight. Having travelled from their own ground, they're about to appear on the ground where the funeral is being held. And you can see the lookout saying that the maternal kin are coming, and the woman in front of them who's saying the same. Metamorphosis also summons a familiar image. But you might like to know that this picture is by a 17th century German naturalist and artist, Maria Sibylla Merian. And metamorphosis is the word that she introduced, just as John Muke introduced the word transplant in the New Guinea Highlands context. Metamorphosis is the word she introduced for her most famous work, published in 1705, on the transformation of insects that she had observed in the Caribbean. One life cycle is reproduction encompasses many forms. And the historian Natalie Zeman Davis comments on Merriam's inclusive, almost ethnographic vision, and you might note the life stages of the plants as well as the insects are depicted in the drawing. I'm sorry about the evident pixelation of this slide, but that may indeed that's a reminder of the artificial nature of these forms. Now, about the same time as Marion was producing her drawings, in 1690, the English philosopher John Locke was using the image of an oak tree to argue that variation in form or substance does not alter identity. And I quote from him, "An oak growing from a plant to a great tree and then lopped is still the same oak, that is, by virtue of its continuing life," and we should be coming back to this. These two differently organised processes, transplantation pointing to diverse origins and destinations, and metamorphosis, an unfolding through diverse forms, are by no means the only modes of multiplication and identity that we might wish to imagine for anthropology, but they will serve as a reminder of diversity even in that. Now, we would not be able to describe the dynamics here, describe in English that is, without the concept of relation. Otherwise, the anthropologist would see neither what is multiple nor what is one. Life cycle transformations only appear if different forms are connected. The identity of a clan requires the management of its kin relations, including the cross-clan kinship of people's sources of growth. Relation itself is, of course, a very general concept. Indeed, in sociocultural anthropology, uncovering relations between phenomena remains as much a goal of analysis and theorizing as it was in the 17th century. In this, anthropology is like countless other disciplines. However, and the qualification is significant, anthropology makes a speciality of being interested in equal measure in relations between persons, interpersonal or institutional, and relations between concepts, epistemic, logical, ideational. In reflecting on the multiple nature of the discipline, as well as its singularity then, I'm going to hold together relations that summon an interpersonal or social dimension and relations that engage concepts and ideas. Now, there's no need to labour the point. It'll be more like a background refrain, although at one juncture we shall see it as of local interest to users of the English language. So if what we value about a future world with anthropology in it includes its multiple character, that is going to be bound up with the work to which anthropologists put the very idea of relations. And I'm going to reflect on 3 or 4 directions open to anthropological knowledge-making. To get a handle on them, I alternate the rubrics of transplantation, metamorphosis, and transplantation, with a conclusion returning to metamorphosis once more, and I shall keep those 4 slides on so that you know roughly where I am in the talk. Now, these rubrics are not mutually exclusive, and they're certainly not analytical devices, but they will hopefully give some imaginative coherence to thinking about singularity and multiplicity, and the reflections will also echo one another. At the same time, each also finds itself looking out onto an unexpected vista. Whether these are our futures will depend on what jumps into the room when we open a few doors this way. Finally, for this presentation, I should say that I have omitted many names, although you may recognise some of the allusions, and with one exception, the names left in are largely of non-anthropologists, or of anthropologists, alas, no longer with us. So this simply serves as a title for the section, and the slide isn't going to change until the next section. The very first committee meeting of the ASA was held in the room of Raymond Firth in London. Before it was the promise of a flourishing social anthropology separated off from a more inclusive stock, where it had shared growing room with physical biological anthropology and archaeology. A transplantation, we might say, in that the embryonic distinctiveness being given to this kind of anthropology needed fresh soil, a new arena within which to expand. That promise did not, of course, mean there was no dissension. If most of the significant figures of the time, in Britain that is, were there, it was not because they would agree on everything, in fact, far from it. I mention this because both the disagreement and the collegiality must have been in Firth's mind when he wrote, and he could have had our president's words in mind as well, anthropological generalizations about human society are collaborative, not definitive, always the work of many hands and from different vantage points. That was in 1951. His observation was explicitly addressed to the way in which its companion social sciences, sociology, psychology, and certain kinds of history, all shared anthropology's general field. It was a reminder that anthropologists are always in the company of others. At the same time, collaborations across disciplines, marked in recent years by interdisciplinary endeavours, go hand in hand with divisions of the discipline within. Division, an internal proliferation into elements such that each generates new growth, as a mass of seedlings is divided into separate planting material, is another form of multiplication. Dividing and spreading, disciplines never stay still. Nonetheless, one may be able to see repetitions in their movements. An observer of the Organization of Anthropology in the United States has noted a pronounced relation, a family resemblance, between the kinds of divisions that separate the subfields of US anthropology at large: cultural and biological anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and those that split these subfields within. The fundamental division is between positivist and interpretative ways of knowing. In fact, she writes, our disagreements about subfields are part of a rift that is not confined to anthropology, nor even to academic discourse. The fault line runs through American culture. In other words, these divisions keep their form across different scales, dividing whole disciplinary domains from one another, so that what divides the sciences and the humanities divides elements within the social sciences, within anthropology, and within subfields of anthropology. The effect is that those particular values are maintained in relation with one another. Mirrored in faculty alignments, intellectual stances also imply social configurations, often experienced by practitioners as intra-departmental or cross-institutional wranglings, conflicts, and alliances. Now, similar observations have been made of anthropology's companion discipline, sociology. A sociological observer, struck by the pervasiveness of the quantitative-qualitative divide within sociological method, noted that what held within was also evinced without, in, for example, sociology's general relationship with economics. Then again, within a quantitative community, one can find an opposition between both quantitative and qualitative versions, and so on. And for this sociologist, such modelling reveals a fractal structure. And coining the term fractal distinction, he drew attention to the way a distinction repeats a relational pattern within itself, as geometric fractals do. Far from the constant fragmentation as disciplines divide, It's the relational character of fractal distinctions, the same relationship repeated over and again, that generates similar structures at multiple levels of organisation. In fact, this may be conducive to the merging of elements as well, for these replications become entangled with cross-cutting possibilities. And I just give you a very brief flavour from what he says. And I'm quoting, "Most of us would say that the distinction of history from sociology reflects the distinction of narrative from causal analysis. Yet social science history is closer to mainstream sociology than to history, and historical sociology is closer to mainstream history than to sociology. That is, we can't assume that that particular dichotomy of narrative versus causal analysis simply produces a linear scale." So these divisions and interactions cannot be encompassed within any simple binarism. Let's return to the observation that it's the relationship that is being replicated over and again, for here is a little surprise. Insofar as a relationship holds its terms steady, as in the relation between positivism and interpretivism, it can be reenacted at any one of a number of local sites and still be recognisable. Each replay of the relation proliferates more local sites, and for the practitioners, such iterations generate new energy for innovation out of old positions. Now, I've used the ethnographic present for these observations, but it may be necessary to move them into the past tense. Over the 20th century, these relational processes supported the institutionalization of disciplines in the university, which in turn reenacted the paradigm of coexisting subject areas asserting their differences and similarities. But if much of this continues today, it surely does so in a changed environment. What jumps out is something else. We could almost call it that common field to which Firth referred, but given that it does not depend on disciplines collaborating in one another's co-recognition in the same way, it more directly recalls the characterization of 1940s British social anthropology as amorphous. In 2007, 3 North American sociologists brought together an interdisciplinary melange of scholars to discuss a field that they had identified as social knowledge, or social knowledge practices. A field isn't quite right, because they refer to the vast expanses of the dense forest in which the making of social knowledge occurs. Their concerns with the working practices by which such knowledge is formulated. And I quote again, "At site after site, heterogeneous knowledge practices are layered upon one another, looping around and through each other, interweaving and branching, sometimes pulling in the same direction, sometimes in contrary directions. Such practices cannot even begin to be circumscribed within traditional disciplinary enclosures. Thought of together, they appear multiplex, polymorphous and porous, an intricate spiderweb they write, in which social scientists and humanists, as well as other social experts, routinely participate as they produce, evaluate and practice the use of social knowledge." And so, perhaps then, that's a glimpse into the future. Anthropology might be in it, but very much in the company of others who may or may not read the relations in the same way. What, for example, might come to be what might count as the social in social knowledge practices. In reflecting on identities and multiplicities in disciplinary interactions, the process of transplantation captures something of the separating and spreading character of academic knowledge practices in general. Now, if there's nothing new in new ground being constantly occupied, it used to be the case that continuity, identity, was given by the repeating acting out of key disputes and disagreements. These were crucial relations, intellectual and interpersonal. It was agreement about what was worth disputing theoretically that bound the disputatious social anthropologists of 1946 together in their fraternity. What we don't know is what kind of kinship among practitioners will give identity to newly emerging fields, when fields look like forests, and when social specification as yet lacks form, is literally amorphous. A challenge, perhaps, or through a crack in the door, perhaps an opportunity to let go of even thinking this might be important. Perhaps it's an already present effect of a field collaborative by default that individual concepts, and ethnography is one we often talk about, become freed from their disciplinary moorings. So too individual theorists, and they don't even have to be social theorists. There are countless scholars whom anthropologists read these days, regardless of disciplinary background, or seemingly morph into honorary anthropologists by this route. I was quoting the historian Davis. Another figure is the philosopher Anne-Marie Moll, who introduces us to an interesting form of the multiple. This is multiplicity through the metamorphosis of contexts. Now, my purpose in beginning with an interdisciplinary milieu, entailing divisions outside as well as within anthropology, was to leave behind any simple notion of the plural. Plurality implies the piling together of singular units, that is, entities amenable to addition. However, the practice of anthropology does not grow simply through the addition of interests. Interests are developed in relation to one another and thereby create multiple, that is, divisible forms of knowledge. When academics get into arguments over positivist and interpretivist paradigms, the components are relations rather than units. In life, growth does not simply mean more of the same. For her part, Moll shows us how people imagine a world of pluralities, even though that's not a very good description of it, and of course she proposes to re-describe it. Medical science, which provides her example, endorses the assumption that the physical world is continuous and the same for everyone. If so, then the only shortfall lies in knowledge of it, and diverse experiences are interpreted as a matter of diverse perspectives on it. Moll analyses the ontology of this perspectivalism, not perspectivism as in Amerindian perspectivism, perspectivalism is her term, showing how the seemingly plural forms of objects in the world are produced by constantly shifting contexts of knowledge. For example, the context in which a disease becomes evident through the instruments by which its effects are recorded. A pluralist assumption would be that each such context is part of a larger whole, so that all the perspectives brought to bear on a problem, different diagnostics, for instance, relate to one thing, a patient's health. Hence the surprise of people creating a singular world out of the plurally diverse ones of their behaviour and experience. Apprehending one world with many perspectives on it, then, people's unitary vision, their pluralist vision, works against what they take to be a natural pluralism. As philosopher commenting on this world, Moll redescribes their state of being in other terms. The forms of their endeavours, she suggests, are created by overlapping and intersecting fields of practices that have the character that she calls multiple. She thus denies the plurality and individuation of units any primordial status. In developing a critique of pluralist perspectivalism, Moll in effect enacts the swiftly changing sites or contexts of events that hold entities captive. And she says, no entity can innocently stay unaltered between various sites, not least because in their interactions at any one site, entities depend upon one another. So what would a multiplist, as opposed to a pluralist assumption about contexts, be? Her concept multiple implies forms of practices conjoined and disjunct from one another in overlapping, relationally complex ways that cannot be added up. Focusing on sites or contexts draws attentions to how the environs of entities are summoned alongside their coming into existence. Together they effect a constant metamorphosis of the lived world, we could say, and although this is at a tangent to Moll's concerns, it's from this process that people derive their own sense of there really only being one world. However, in talking of context, I've already used this philosopher's account and turned it in an anthropological direction. Contexts render the world infinitely divisible, or multiple, in the same way as a team of medical experts, divided by their diverse disciplines, each finds a patient's condition intelligible only to him or herself. Now, unlike the term ethnography, context, of course, was never one to which anthropologists could lay claim, although the way it is used is probably another matter. When the historian Davis drew attention to the ethnographic sensibilities of the naturalist artist Miriam of the European 17th century, she noticed that rather than wrenching the specimens from context, Miriam's vision was ecological. Miriam depicted individual caterpillars or frogs in the phases of their life cycle alongside their surroundings and the food they ate. Any particular being was caught up in the life of others, and the caterpillar's leafy support was more than just background. Multiplicity is the overview an artist might have of each form within its context, each context being a division of the process of growth. Now, simultaneously, Miriam depended on local knowledge. Seekers after knowledge are in the company of others whether they say so or not, and it was known that naturalists went to distant places to make observations, as Miriam did to the Caribbean in 1699. But the sugar planters in the Dutch colony in Suriname could not understand her preoccupations. And Miriam herself wrote in her diary, "People ridiculed me for seeking anything other than sugar." But then resident African and Amerindians assisted her far more than the European planters, and Miriam drew on the knowledge of both slaves and Carib Indians. Interestingly, the reader knows this is the case. Naturalists in Europe rarely mentioned the servants who assisted them with their research, whereas from Miriam we hear of the conversations that she had. I should have been paying more attention to the screen. It seems to be only half there. It doesn't matter. The other half of the image, in fact, tells you what the picture is about, but perhaps that doesn't matter. One is caught by one's own ingenuity, always. Anyway, the point is that we know that Miriam talked with the slaves and the Carib Indians, and that naturalists in Europe rarely mentioned the servants who assisted them with their research, whereas from her we hear of the conversations that she had. Here, in the conversational tone that Miriam adopted, lay a distinctiveness of form, and Davis says, Miriam's scientific style and conversational exchange encouraged ethnographic writing indifferent to the civilized savage boundary. Yet something of a surprise here too. The interpersonal context of Miriam's work included her acknowledgement of other sources of observation, although to conclude that she was deliberately giving her account a relational texture introduces a present-day sensibility. A converse anachronism to present-day ears is her own reference to slaves and servants. At that time in Europe, servants were regarded as extensions of the persons of their masters and mistresses. So the multiple hands that we might today perceive in such products as the beautiful drawings that Marion did from life were all part of one hand, Marion's. Her servants were at once hers and her. These notions of property, we might say, with Moll's arguments in mind, were another mode in which a sense of oneness is created. What jumps out, however, is the contrast that Marion herself made between the planter's preoccupations with the organisation of sugar production and the context of her work with creatures in whose lives she was totally absorbed. For in her contrast, we see a radical juxtaposition of living forms. Or rather, if we perceive a radical juxtaposition, then in that comparative relation, we also perceive possibilities for critique. This is not unique to anthropology, though in its practices of comparison, anthropology has a special interest in the comparison of relations. Like Moll's, its juxtaposition introduced a performative or critical multiplicity. And there's a recent example that we might want to take with us into the future. It's captured in a colleague's contrast between scalability and non-scalability. The author, an anthropologist, suggests that scalability came into being with European colonial plantations in the 16th and 17th centuries, and not least the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. The factories of the then future of the Industrial Revolution were to model themselves on such plantations. Scalability already exists as a term. The author's neologism is non-scalability. It's time, she says, to have a theory of it. Scalability points to processes typical of industrial production that allow infinite expansion in the size of activities without transforming their object or product. Scalability, in her words, is not an ordinary feature of nature, and she says, ordinarily things that expand change as they take on new materials and relationships. So why have people called expansion growth as if it were a biological process? The success of sugar production lay in planters experimenting with types of cane and soil in order to facilitate the interchangeability of forms. The varieties of sugarcane propagated were genetic isolates without interspecies ties, that is, with no history of either companion species or disease relations. The same crop could be grown everywhere suitable. If this meant rendering the landscape uniform for a uniform crop, it also meant erasing its social features, the claims, demons, ownerships of those already there. And this was true also of the cane workers. And I quote, as cane workers in the New World enslaved Africans, as cane workers in the New World, enslaved Africans had great advantage from the grower's perspective. Slaves had no local social relations and no easy place to run. Like the cane itself, they'd been uprooted. Ingenious indeed is this new era of expansion without transformation, of growth without metamorphosis. It reinforced, if it did not lay the grounds for, the pluralist ideas, the many as an amassing of units in the cosmology that Moll redescribes. A critical view might ask whether the world of scalable plantation-like enterprises is available to redescription at all. Can it be redescribed? A door blown open, perhaps, a glimpse into a world that discourages or inhibits metamorphosis. And what jumps out here is what jumps out of Marion's 17th century comment, tools for criticism and the need thereof. The author, who divides non-scalability from scalability, makes it clear that scalability may have good and bad outcomes. At the same time, given the widespread acceptance of the advantages of the scalable, the critical thrust of her arguments is to point to non-scalable things that we might wish to value, a prime example being ecological complexity. In her view, anthropologists need a theorization of the scalable in order to help them notice non-scalable phenomena. And such theorization could not, of course, proceed without relational finesse. The concept of transplantation has a second side, one that is as much about the soil as the plant. When in the Papua New Guinea highlands, a sister's child is called someone's transplant, the idiom points to something of that person's clan material that has taken root elsewhere. Significantly for the clan in or on whose soil the child now grows, its external origins, its roots elsewhere, are never forgotten. The positive value put on relations outside the clan is reflected in ceremonial exchanges of wealth that follow a lifetime of payments from birth to death, and the maternal kin about to appear on the funeral ground will eventually be given wealth in compensation for their lifelong support. The same logic is there in the emphasis that women place on always getting fresh planting material for their sweet potato gardens. Sweet potato vines are never planted in the same soil twice. Women circulate the material between different locations. To replant vines in the same ground would impede both fertility and variety. Maintaining diversification of origin also requires continuity of recognition, for the specific identity or non-scalability of their origins is not obliterated, it's cherished. Thus, the identity of the sister's child depends on the sister's continuing identity in relation to her natal clan. From the sister's child's perspective, continuing relations with its mother's people, its roots or stock, is essential to its own flourishing. Very different are the protocols of organ transplants in North America. For many years, though things have changed somewhat, much was done to put to one side the social origins of bodily organs. As healthy and usable body parts, their origins were reascribed to the technologies and practices of professional expertise, another instance of scalability. I have to mention, of course, that Margaret Locke has described how different the concerns of Japan have been in the past, so it's necessary to be specific. For Canadians and North Americans, then, the material of the organ could be considered separately from whatever other connotations it may have carried. In deceased donations, for instance, it was regarded as crucial to the health of the patient that he or she did not dwell on the dead donor. The surprise here, or perhaps it's no surprise to the anthropologist, has been the way in which the relatives of organ donors and recipients have sometimes reacted to the anonymity of transplant protocols. The keeping of social origins may matter a great deal. What was always true in non-anonymous donations between relatives could be extended to embrace strangers. In other words, the material of the bodily organ was also thought of as connective tissue, a metamorphosis of contexts, imagining part of their relative as continuing to live in another person, has led to instances where a deceased donor's kinsfolk have tried to identify the recipient, while the families of both donors and recipients may feel that the bond between them is enough to create social connections. To tell the story this way implies that these families were restoring something of the relational context that had been excised in the process of organ extraction. At the same time, one supposes that these new bonds were regarded as substitutes for the real thing. What we do know is that this was not a kinship system in which the transplant carries positive value in terms of social diversification. For that, one would need to consider what has been happening to ideas about genetic diversity in reproductive technology and the relational consequences of gamete donation. Yet even here, the potential of multiple parentage is less likely to be regarded of value in itself than as a complexity to be endured when conventional procreation is not possible. so that the way kin are put back in underlines a very different logic by the contrast with which the Papua New Guinean scholar explains that a sister's child is a transplant. But what kind of comparison, you'll ask, is this? Shouldn't we be comparing, if we're thinking of organ transplantation, shouldn't we be comparing hospital procedures in Papua New Guinea, say? And I'm going to come back to hospitals in a moment. For sure, we can't turn to horticulture in North America because we already know that we're not going to find the same nexus of soils, plants, and the growth of persons. Nonetheless, for the moment, each mode of transplant is a prompt to us as anthropologists to look further at what we think we do know. Consider again the remedial implication that the North American organ transplant families were restoring something of a relational context. There is a suggestive analogy with today's place of kinship studies in anthropology at large, a new burgeoning of discussion that finds kinship in all kinds of locations, taken root and grown, one might say, almost unseen. Topics once shorn of any kinship dimension have seemingly recovered it. But what is it that anthropologists today are recovering as kinship? Suppose, instead of the families and relatives of organ donors and recipients making up a social deficit, donors and recipients invent families and relatives for themselves. Just such a situation has been described for living organ donations in Israel. Now, all kinds of bureaucratic protocols accompany the planting of medical techniques in new places. And this is where hospitals and questions about comparison come back in. Observing medical practices in the Papua New Guinean hospital couldn't avoid taking into account the very phenomena, medical and bureaucratic, that produce international perceptions of what a healthy transplant is. The surprise question that comes from the Israeli ethnography is whether these medical and bureaucratic assumptions would produce the same kind of kinship in Papua New Guinea too. And obviously I must explain this a bit. Inventing families and relatives, the inventors were Israelis who had access to kidney transplant agencies prepared to match potential recipients and donors. This is obviously living donation. The agency thus acted as an intermediary. And I should just add that the ethnographic study was done just before the law was changed to make various forms of payment for organs illegal. However, the existing consensus then was that organ donations were really only acceptable on grounds of altruism. And one way for a matched pair to qualify as ethically suitable was to claim that theirs fell into the category of a living donation between kin. After all, between kin lay the naturalists of family duty and altruism. Once biological compatibility was established, the potential donor and recipient would present their case to various committees, including an account of how they were related. As one matchmaking intermediary described it, we sit together, we talk, we try to find a story, make a connection, we invent a story, a cousin, an uncle, from nothing. Kinship before the transplant rather than after. And although it was built up from some of the realities of the pair's lives, this kind of relationship was not expected to endure beyond their obtaining the requisite paperwork. Such tactics fed into the fact that for transplant bureaucrats, kinship connections were thought to produce a natural propensity to donate and receive organs. Pre-transplant and invented kinship, then, was not just the creation of the pair and their intermediaries seeking a match, but of the whole administrative process that oversaw and controlled transplant procedures. And the ethnographer writes, if the concept of kin may be played with tactically by the welfare state and its bureaucrats as a tool to allocate benefits, it can surely be manoeuvred by people who wish to adapt to the state's definition of kinship. Kinship can thus have a distinct bureaucratic existence. Transplant relatedness emerges from this analysis as a set of scripts privileged by an administrative apparatus. At the same time, the ethnographer insists that the kinship relation is not a substitute for the real thing. It itself evinces and enacts kinship values, and she writes, "What gets to be performed before the committee is essentially the kinship relation itself." Israeli transplant relatedness has its own character. It exists on an ad hoc, instrumentalized basis for a specific purpose and with limited temporality. Kinship brought into being by an organ transplant process is not such a far cry from what in UK medicine has come to be called translational research. That is, research translatable into clinical applications and back again. The point is that an idea is perceived to have moved from one operational base to another. And while the model may have come from management practices, given the Israeli situation, one wonders about the form of the ideas that travel this way. Just as potential donors and recipients set out to connect themselves, when researchers set out to make their findings translational, will their ideas not be ad hoc, instrumentalized for a specific purpose and with a limited temporality? But translational scientists would never say they weren't doing the real thing. On the contrary, they might congratulate themselves for producing outcomes with demonstrable impact. And here, we suddenly do see a comparison with a transplanted sister's child who must forever acknowledge its origins. In the UK, higher education policy places huge and positive value on ideas perceived to have moved between different operational bases. You cannot show the impact of something without showing it's been transplanted from one location to another, and knowledge transfer in the vernacular. Distinctiveness of origin is conserved. It always was in assertions of intellectual property, but these days conserving distinctiveness has new purposes. Academics from the UK are especially sensitive here. Colleagues are deeply embroiled in a national assessment exercise at this very moment, where judgments about research performance place extra value on its impact, meaning impact beyond the discipline where it first emerged and grew. Knowledge must be transplanted to have impact. But I can speak for more than the UK when we see what's coming through the door. You might think I've chosen a rather circuitous route, from Papua New Guinea's transplants to organ donation to bureaucratic protocols. But consider what jumps out here. It's a question about research process, about what in the future will be open and what will be concealed. The current UK obsession with demonstrating impact is a local turn of the screw on contemporary data evaluation protocols found everywhere. It compels scholars to provide a paper trail of the stages by which an idea is rendered into one that can embed itself in other soil. They have to show how it arrived at its point of impact, a bureaucratization of immutable mobiles, one might say. It's not that relations cease to be important, but that the relations picked out as steps to knowledge-making are, in terms of the paper trail, the ones that make knowledge transferable and scalable. Origins cease to be non-scalable. All that matters is that ideas have come from somewhere else. Again, there's not going to be anything special to anthropology here, except for one issue. For many anthropologists, exposing the relational construction of their ethnographic and theoretical accounts has been an important way in which they've made visible the contingency of their knowledge. The steps by which it's built up is part of the knowledge itself. And they would say that for a transplant to grow in new soil, for knowledge to carry a truth, the relational construction has to be considered part of the outcome. There must be continuity of identity. This, of course, is how we ordinarily distinguish knowledge from information. So what are anthropologists' interests here? The contingency of their knowledge is bound up with its social source. When they write, anthropologists often weave into their accounts structures and idioms drawn from the concerns of their interlocutors. But more generally, anthropologists' exploration of relations of all kinds stand in for an aspiration to see beyond their own conventions of knowledge-making. What this non-achievable aspiration does achieve is a humility of sorts towards those who provide information, along with the robustness that comes from being able to give a social account of its acquisition. They may express it in terms of an open-ended interest in people's relational worlds. I say open-ended advisedly. Relations are inherently transformative in that one is never sure of their outcome. With the door now swinging on its hinges, there would indeed be some consequences to concealing this open-ended interest in imagining that knowledge might have origins. I've been sketching the ways in which social cultural anthropologists might engage the multiplicity of phenomena while retaining anthropologists' distinctive concern with relations both conceptual and interpersonal. Various thoughts have jumped out, glimpses of possible future entailments. Already with us, the three I've remarked are no more than place markers for many more. First, a field one did not realise was there, and the example was social knowledge practices, in which disciplines both are and are not principal reference points. Always imaginable, that equivocation enrolls new questions as to what is to count as social. Secondly, the need to keep creating conceptual tools for analysis, critique, and social criticism. And the example was the dual concept of scalability and non-scalability. Thirdly, the shaping of the research process through ever-changing techniques and conventions of knowledge-keeping. The example was a bureaucratic redescribing of the steps by which knowledge is gained, displacing one set of relations by another. So another door opens, and what jumps out this time? It's the realization that had I listed those three examples at the outset, they would have seemed self-evident, banal, thoroughly inadequate for conveying the scope of a discipline. Yet each has quite dramatic anthropological import as interruptions to conversations already going on. Whether positive or negative, the interruptions divert existing preoccupations, transforming or metamorphosing their contexts. And there is no shortcut I could have taken, like producing a list, to communicating that. We can expect contexts to go on metamorphosing. Let me conclude this last section with moments of metamorphosis, and this will be short. Is this a metamorphosed context for the life cycle exchanges involving prestations to maternal kin built on the transplant status of the sister's child? In mind is a study of card playing carried out in 2009 to 10 in a New Guinea Highlands town. Players regard the games as proceeding at different speeds, slow and fast, and the anthropologist argues for the potential of such perceptions as an analytic by which people reflect on social change. Like the Papua New Guinean scholar John Muke, the anthropologist makes a relation, a running analogy to earlier ethnography from, in fact, about the time this photograph was taken in 71, to the Highlands ceremonial wealth exchanges I referred to. In particular, were exchanges that had more or less acquired their own rationale independently of life cycle events, and he uses them as a reference point for the conservative end of modern-day slow games. Yet at the time, the exchanges had been far from conservative. Rather, in being no longer solely tethered to life cycle events such as funerals, these forms of exchange had undergone inflation. The ethnographer of the card games puts into my head the thought that they, the exchangers, had once, years ago, been the original fast game. For people at the time, ceremonial exchange involved imagining what new forms of wealth could do, what possibilities would come into being. And the anthropologist, seeing people undertaking their own analyses, pushes old debates about reverse anthropology to new limits, a metamorphosis for our contexts of analysis. To be with anthropology in the future is not just a matter of keeping the ethnographic past alive by its relevance to the present, but also of taking seriously present developments, such as two-speed card games, which recontextualize previous ethnographic moments in ways that one would never have imagined. Perhaps we wish to keep that relational facility open, just as the social science disciplines in general for so long kept the distinction between interpretivism and positivism. Is it relations like this where we might want to place the continuity and identity of anthropology? Let's return to John Locke's 17th century, and of course I'm referring to Europe's 17th century. John Locke's reminder of the oak tree in its life cycle. The metamorphosis of the tree, its many different forms, underlines the non-obviousness of identity. Identity is not something one sees without specifying relations between particular moments. Now, the philosopher does not talk about relations at this moment, although he does elsewhere. The point for us in retrospect is the non-obviousness of the concept of relation itself. For the English term relation was undergoing a kind of metamorphosis at the time when he was writing. In the sphere of interpersonal relations of all European languages, only English took it to one of its limits. In the 17th century, they began to use the term for kinsfolk, not just in relating connections between kin as they might relate connections between any sets of entities, but as a substantive noun. My relations or my relatives are my kin. This usage began then and has been deployed thus ever since. Now, needless to say, English speakers have no problems about keeping the contexts of usage separate. Yet for many years, and it must have been an impetus to the ASA's vision, relations had a concrete appeal in British social anthropology that to other social cultural anthropologists could seem quite strange. A tiny change when languages are always changing. Nonetheless, the example of relation is arresting to the extent that certain anthropologists are coloured by the English language. Through the graciousness of our hosts, whom I'd like to acknowledge once more, it's the language we're speaking this afternoon, but we need to be wary of it. This morning. No. But why have I gone into the past at all? Not just because what comes through the door is not necessarily new, but clearly because that is where we of the here and now should be in the future. For alas, being a keynote speaker does not give one insight into the actual future any more penetrating than anyone else's. None of us knows. All the same, looking at these images from 300 years ago in ways Marion would never have done, or reading 17th century philosophical arguments in a manner quite strange to the writer, both prompt to thought. If we survive the oncoming storm of data obliteration, should people 300 years hence find in today's preoccupation with relations of all kinds something illuminating for their own, to us inconceivable concerns, then a corner of our anthropology will be with them in a future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Strathern. Professor Arthur Morita of Oxford University. Please to the podium.
Thank you very much, Professor Marilyn Strathern, for a wonderful talk. which makes me think a lot. And thank you very much for giving me such a privileged occasion to be a discussant on our talk. I'm actually Morita from Osaka University. I'd like to think a bit about, from my viewpoint, about how to talk about relations. Starting with the history of social anthropology that pursued both relations between concepts and relations between persons, Professor Marilyn Strathern has argued how relations themselves have metamorphoses and multiplied in often unexpected ways. As an admirer of her work, there seems to be nothing to add to it. But by capturing this opportunity, I would try to tackle the aspects of relations from a slightly different viewpoint. Professor Strathern has demonstrated making relations often brings about surprising effect. A new relation transforms the terms it connects, or reveals unnoticed aspects of them, and thus significantly expand our thought. In this sense, relations do epistemic work. We can find similar performativity of relations at the core of science. Knowing is, after all, relating cause and effect, condition and event, and action and intention or agency. Actually, I'm working on anthropology of science and technology, so I'll talk a bit from that viewpoint. As the science studies scholar Andrew Pickering has argued, in experimental science, an object of inquiry emerges through its entanglement with the experimental devices and tools, as well as the concepts that frame the phenomena under study. Be it particles or molecules, what an object of science does and looks like depends on the particular relations formed in the experimental system. Multiplicity of objects in medicine that Anne-Marie Moore has argued is an upshot of this relational ontology. As Strathern made it clear, it does not mean that this multiplicity represents the difference of perspectives on the single reality. It is not the case that we can adapt the partial enactments of these partial enactments to reconstruct the whole object. Probably one of the most forceful points of Strathern's post-plural view of relations rests here. While denying single reality that encompasses all the perspectives, Strathern and Moore have also denied partially enacted objects are isolated from each other. It is often the case that relating the observations gained in different experimental settings brings about surprising findings and thus reveals an unexpected aspect of the object under study. The notion of the singular reality, which encompasses all the potential enactment of the object, preclude all these possible explorations and potential relations. If we stop insisting on the singular ultimate reality, we will find an expanding array of partial objects, which multiply from within through scientific efforts to relate the divergent enactment in different observational and experimental settings. Of course, it is not only Marilyn Strathern who has insisted relational nature of knowledge. Bruno Latour and Michel Caron's actor network theory is also known for the similar approach. However, there seems to be something unique in her way of dealing relations. Unlike actor network theory that traces the expansive web of relations, Strathern focuses on the duality of relations that connects the terms both from within and without. The New Guinean Highlanders transplanted from the maternal clan is a telling example of this. The transplant of people creates relations between the two clans, which have pre-existed before the marriage that transplanted a woman from one clan to the other. For clans, the relation can be seen as external one, which connects pre-existing entities. However, from the viewpoint of children resulted from this marriage, transplant constitutes a very condition for their bodily existence and social identity. In this aspect, the relation of transplant is internal relation that constitutes the personhood. It is not only this duality of internal and external relations that makes Strathern unique. There is also certain symmetry between the object of inquiry and her ethnographic method. Strathern's ethnography is like a web of relations that carefully woven together. By constantly relating seemingly distanced objects, as she just have done, she reveals unnoticed internal relations that in fact constitutes the notion that frames the very attempt of the investigation. In this sense, internal relations she finds in the object have recursive quality, which questions the concepts that have guided the exploration and reveals the internal relation it involves. Elsewhere, I have characterized Strathern's approach as the ethnographic machine to direct attention to this web of relations constituting her work. It may sound strange, but I use the word machine literally because mechanical engineers actually define a machine as a set of relations that perform a certain work. In a machine, parts are put in a certain relation to each other so that they bring about a certain material effect. A machine involves dynamic relations within, while working with the external objects by creating a relation with them. In a similar vein, I would say Strathern's ethnography has a mechanical quality. It is constituted by dynamic relations between notions and objects. It generates effect of bringing about surprise. By constantly relating the external relations between the objects under study and the internal relations that constitute the very viewpoints that describe these relations. Here we come to the point to think of the future. The notion of machine is not unrelated to the notion of the future, not least in science. Both scientists themselves and science-studied scholars have seen at the core of science machines for generating surprise. For example, criticizing the linear view of scientific development, Andrew Pickering and Hans-Jörg Weinberger have elucidated that mechanical assemblages of scientific experiment that generate surprises, object of knowledge, beyond the scientist's expectation. Borrowing the words of the biologist Francois Jacobs, Weinberger calls experimental systems machine for making the future. In my view, Strathern has demonstrated that ethnography can be a similar kind of artifact that constantly generates surprise by creating and tracing relations. But what kind of a future these machines create? Pickering argues that there is non-linear development in science because the interaction between humans and non-human agencies in experiments always brings about unexpected development. Similarly, Strathern has evoked the non-linear image of future in her keynote speech. Sitting in a room and looking through the door. Perhaps future is not out there down the linear path. Rather, it is within the machine we create with anthropological relations. Like the image of a person sitting in the room, to be attentive to the uncertain behavior of the machines requires certain passivity that brings about responsiveness to surprise. The future of anthropology may rest on how we handle the internal relations, the fractal division within our own viewpoints, and external relations, the relations between differently situated viewpoints, including both those of people we study and those of different anthropological traditions. Conferences such as this will be a valuable occasion to make these relations visible by creating further relations. To return to the metaphor of the machine for making future, the future of anthropology might reside within this complex set of interpersonal, conceptual, institutional, and collaborative relations we have created in this conference, or we are creating in this conference. Just like experimental systems of science, we have witnessed that this complex set of relations has generated surprises. I am quite optimistic about this unpredictability. After all, life with surprise is far more preferable than one without it, particularly those who have chosen this strange occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite one of your
Thank you very much. I don't have much time, but I'd like to just take a minute at the beginning to thank the organizers of this very special conference for bringing us all together, for bringing Professor Strathern here too, and for also giving me the opportunity to respond to her extremely thought-provoking talk. As for many of us here this morning, Marilyn Strathern's writing has had a profound effect on my own work over the years, and so it's in a spirit of gratitude, as well I hope as of participation in a shared project of anthropological exploration and reimagining that I offer these comments. And really what I'm just trying to do is open up a very small corner of this very large paper. So I'll begin perhaps obliquely where the paper ends, with Maria Sibylla Merian, 52 years old, already a noted painter of European insects, financially independent but hardly wealthy, 20 years of marriage and 5 more of an ascetic withdrawal into a mystical Labadist community of West Friesland firmly behind her, riding a donkey through the tropical forests of the Dutch colony of Suriname, 20-year-old daughter and Amerindian slaves alongside her, the only European woman who journeyed exclusively in pursuit of her science in the 17th and 18th century, as Natalie Zeman Davis put it. Merian was raised in a family of artists and publishers, and she developed an early fascination for nature study. She began at 13 with silkworms, which is a family connection, and of course, a connection that opens up onto other histories of Europe-East Asian connection. But she was soon preoccupied by caterpillars in general, and above all, by their transformations. It was an eccentricity in a girl. But as with the similarly youthful heroine of the Heian story, the lady who loved insects, who didn't pluck her eyebrows or blacken her teeth, who was in fact not very ladylike at all, Merian's peculiarity was one of sensitivity and insight that indicated a philosophical refinement. She collected her own insects, and she bred their larvae through their life cycle, drawing and painting from life. She occupied a world refreshed by the introduction of the microscope, in which the new preoccupation was with observation and the classifications that it made possible. She was fascinated by insects, and her relations with them produced a further fascination with the profusions of time, place, and with relation itself. As never before, as Professor Strathern said, she gave the drama of metamorphosis unity. Her paintings present a dynamic and interactive nature, the kind of world that anthropologists are entirely habituated to both describing and critiquing. Its principles are transformation, change, holism, and the overthrowing of an earlier European taxonomy dating from Aristotle that segregated the insects into those that crawl and those that fly, and so, without even knowing it, segregated the butterflies and moths from their larvae. 100 years after Merian was developing this proto-ecological vision, Jules Michelet, a historian, also an insect lover, author of a famous 7-volume history of the French Revolution, and an admirer of Merian's work, examined her hand-coloured copper plates in Paris. He saw change, impermanence, and relation. He saw the vitality of life itself erupting against the artificial formalism of scientific categories. But the questions that had been gnawing at him in his studies of European revolution were not answered in her paintings. What is it that carries through from one form to another, from one type of being to another? What is it that persists? What kind of thing is this? Is it one or is it many? What, in other words, is the relation? The more Michelet stared at Merian's images, the more dissatisfied he became. He needed to access not just the fact of relation, but the nature of relation, and the relation of relations too, the form and quality of relation, its means of holding together and coming apart. Here is the larva, and here's the adult. The event that lies between these states these states of being was, said Michelet, a revolution, an astonishing tour de force. Because the relation of these beings, that an advance in science recognized as both one and multiple, posed a special but also familiar problem. where the caterpillar is earthbound, hiding in the shadows, a leaf eater and without genitalia, the butterfly is always in flight, drawn to the light, a nectar drinker, and entirely focused on sex. Metamorphosis, writes Michelet, anticipating Kafka, is a thing to confound and almost to terrify the imagination. One being enters the chrysalis, quite another comes out. All is thrown aside, he writes, all is and ought to be changed. And then he adds something in an altogether different register, something that unexpectedly and ontologically grounds his mystic materialism in profound affinity. Throughout my life, he wrote, each day I died and was born again. Many and many times I've passed from the larva into the chrysalis and into a more complete condition, the which, after a while, incomplete under other conditions, has put me in the way of accomplishing a new circle of metamorphosis. And considering this, makes me wonder if perhaps the thing to wonder about with metamorphosis is not that it's an unfolding, or even that it's a break or transformation, but that in a deeply serious sense, it's completely mysterious and inaccessible. And I wonder if relation is actually the term we need here, if only because in its profound lack of specificity, it risks being attenuated to the point of blandness. What isn't a relation? How do we distinguish between relations of different value and significance? But to continue with concretizing the metaphor, metamorphosis in its mystery may nonetheless be a powerful site from which to consider anthropology. This is not just because of the well-worn alchemy of fieldwork, nor just because the confounding fact of metamorphosis is best revealed by close empirical observation, but rather because it points simultaneously to a form of association that is both relation and non-relation, a form of connection that characterizes much of what anthropologists do and discover as our attention moves among connections that, as Professor Strathern puts it, are both conceptual and interpersonal. And for those of us who are concerned with non-humans in the broad sense of not just animals, but of natural phenomena, of things, and for want of a better word, let's call them energies, the question of non-relation can be not only vitally ethnographic, but also deeply anthropological. Such entities are not simply the occasions for symbolic thinking. Their withdrawal, enclosure, apartness, radical difference, indifference, refusal, secrecy, silence, or detachment challenges us to situate humans and their affairs in the world more carefully and more humbly. To be cautious, just as an example, for instance, about the hubris in a concept like the currently fashionable Anthropocene. And to imagine a future anthropology emergent in an unimaginably metamorphosed context, a world in which our place as persons may bear little relation to what we struggle to account for today. The best experiments eventually fail, collapse, and transform, and that's really not a bad thing, or not necessarily a bad thing. Too often, as we know, persistence has been the enemy of creativity. Perhaps, as Professor Strathern suggests, the future anthropology that we might strive for is one that's the future anthropology we might strive for is one that's willing to break free of its cocoon, its founding concept of non-embracing anthropos.
Thank you very much. I very much like to continue, but we are well into the lunchtime, and we are running out of time. So, if you have some comments to their comments, very quickly, please.
I simply wanted to say how much I appreciate both sets of comments. I think you've taken the paper very much in the spirit with which it was presented, even at the moments at which the divergence, of course, becomes the more interesting thing to focus upon. And I very much appreciated in the first set of comments the extension and the analogies, the relational stretching that was done through the concepts of the machine. And in the second set of comments, the focusing in on the mechanism of metamorphosis, which actually reveals issues of discontinuity and non-relation that somehow aren't encompassed by the way in which relation was being understood. But what this does allow me to do is just say, if I may, appropriate this moment on behalf of all the visitors who have come here. Perhaps right at the beginning of the Congress, I know there'll be many moments in which to do this subsequently, but I would just want to say how much, if I may speak on behalf of the visitors, we do appreciate being here and being under the auspices of the double affiliations which you share and head. Thank you very much, Professor.
All right, this is the end of this session. Thank you very much for attending, everybody. Thank you.